Incredible that this house is still standing. Back in 1843, this house was the scene of one of, if not the worst crime scenes in Staten Island history. A fire happened, and amid the smoke and smoldering were two bodies. It was Emeline Houseman and her daughter, 20-month-old daughter, Emeline Houseman. They lived there. At first, they said, well, it was an accident. It was a fire. And then, as the investigators looked more into it, they noticed that there were broken bones on them. Their skulls had been shattered. It certainly was not just a house fire. It was certainly something else. A cover-up to a murder, a double murder. So investigators quickly determined that it was deliberately set and intended to destroy the evidence. However, some accounts suggest that the flames didn't spread as expected, leaving the crime scene more intact than the killer had likely intended. Investigators determined that Emeline and Annalisa had been murdered before the fire even began. Yeah, there it is. It's really hard to read now. Wife of George Housman, died December 25th, 1843. It's easier to see on the screen. The fact that her name is on this stone, I'm assuming they're possibly buried together or just directly next to each other. Unless this smaller one is for Annalisa. George Housman, Emeline's husband, was a schooner captain who was often away at sea. This may have left Emeline and Annalisa vulnerable, making the crime even more shocking. The fact that someone close to the family was accused made it all more scandalous. Heinous by today's standards, of course, but especially by the standards of the 1840s. Now, I also want to point out that George Housman is not buried here. This is only Emeline and her daughter. George remarried after this, and they are all buried in a Housman family plot in a different cemetery, not too far from here. So, unfortunately, depending how you look at it, Emeline and Annalisa are here by themselves just as they died in that house. Now, the person that they call the Witch of Staten Island, Polly Bodine, she was related to those people who died in the fire. She was Emeline's sister-in-law, Annalisa's aunt. In the early hours of December 26th, the next day after the fire, Polly was seen leaving Staten Island by ferry. A chambermaid on board recalled her drinking gin and eating pie, looking exhausted and on edge. Later, she was spotted at a pawn shop in Manhattan, her face hidden by a hooded cape and green veil, selling items owned by Emeline, including Emeline's jewelry and clothing. In the following days, she was seen wandering the city streets, looking dazed and desperate. Then on New Year's Eve, she was arrested. 3 days later, while in custody, she gave birth to a stillborn child. The newspapers, of course, wasted no time in labeling it an illicit offspring. Then came the court case, really one of the most sensational legal battles of New York City history at that time. Polly's first trial, one of 3, was held in Richmond County, and of course was an absolute media circus. Polly's lifestyle, in the eyes of 19th century society, made her guilty before she ever even set foot in a courtroom. She had separated from her husband and was romantically involved with a New York apothecary named George Waite. She had undergone abortions at a time when public opinion was beginning to turn against the practice, and for many, that was enough to condemn her outright. Although the trials were just about murder, they became a morality play about female virtue as well. And the newspapers of that time played up her immoral behavior to paint her as a villain. The pawnshop clerk who identified her was a key witness in the trial. The prosecution claimed that this was clear evidence of her guilt, while the defense argued that circumstantial evidence alone wasn't enough to convict, that she could have possibly already been in possession of these items, or that maybe she went into the house after the fire and took them. Not exactly a great move, but that also doesn't determine murder. Edgar Allan Poe himself weighed in, grimly predicting that Polly might escape justice due to the city's incompetent handling of these cases. And the trial ended in hung jury. And then came the second trial, which was moved to Manhattan. Spectators, many of them women, packed the courtroom daily. P.T. Barnum added to the hysteria, displaying a wax figure of Polly in his museum. A grotesque old witch hacking her victims to pieces. And at the end of the second trial, the jury did convict her, but for some reason the verdict was overturned. On to her third and final trial. It took place in Newburgh, New York, where her defense team managed to dismantle key witness testimonies. This time, after more than 2 years in jail, Polly walked free. Polly Bodine's trials were among the first in the U.S. to demonstrate the power of media influence on public opinion and in the courtroom. The case also contributed to involving discussions about the circumstantial evidence. Should or could someone be convicted without direct proof? Her conviction being overturned showed that courts were still grappling with how much weight to give public sentiment. I mean, just playing devil's advocate here, what was her true motive? If robbery was the goal, why was there such brutality? Why would she stay in New York? Why would she go just over to Manhattan to pawn those items? And especially so soon after the murders. Was she guilty of these crimes, or was she just a common thief, an opportunist at best? Public opinion never really fully cleared her name. Polly lived her life laying low in relative obscurity. She had 2 children, but she still lived a very quiet, secret life. And walking here among these graves, it's interesting to think about, if Polly didn't do it, then who did? And if she was guilty, what could have driven her to commit such a brutal act on her own family members? At this point, more than 180 years later, those answers will forever lie in these 2 cemeteries. So the witch of Staten Island is buried here. The Fairview Cemetery. She died at 82 years old, having never been convicted of that murder or those murders. And when she died, she took that to the grave. She's the only one that will ever know if in fact she murdered her sister-in-law and her niece. And so that's the crazy story of the witch of Staten Island, Polly Bodine. I guess we'll never know. No one will ever know if she really did murder those 2. All right, I'm getting out of here. See you in the next video.